Segment, we're going to talk about the various components that are available inside SceneDesigner. These components can be seen on the Components panel, which I'm unhiding right here. If you select this drop-down, this lists all of the components that are available in SceneDesigner. Components can be added by plugins, so you can add additional components that you would like for your own game. Also, components can be created from scratch with the New Component button. Let me cover the default components that are added, that are included. The first one up is an actor component. This allows you to specify a KFM file and a sequence ID, and whether or not you want the actor to accumulate transforms. And this is used for all of the animated characters in the scene here. So if we select on one of the skeletons and look at its properties, you'll notice that it has an actor component. Let's zoom in on this one. So he's right here. He has an actor component. It has a KFM path that points to the skeleton's KFM. And if you click the drop down, you can choose a different animation. This particular scene was authored with the walk animation to look correct for this movement of this character. The next component is a camera component. This contains properties for the aspect ratio, the field of view, whether or not the camera is orthographic. If we switch to a camera in the scene, you can look at the properties here and see, right up here. And we'll see these better if we actually switch to use this camera. So here's this camera here, and you can notice that if we change the aspect ratio, the bars on the top and bottom change appropriately, or change the field of view, or turn it into an orthographic camera. The next component is an inherited transformation component. This is very similar to a transformation component, which contains translation, rotation, and scale, except that any of any combination of those can be inherited. So if we look at this particular camera, which I'll switch to, notice that this camera is following this skeleton as he's walking around. If we look at the inherited transformation component, we notice that the source entity for this object is skeleton. Also, you can specify an attachment point, and this is the node name inside of that entity. So if that entity is referencing a scene graph, the node name for the NI node inside that scene graph that you wish to attach to can be typed in here. You can also say whether or not you want to inherit rotation, translation, and scale. So notice the camera is sort of pitching back and forth. I can just turn inheriting rotation off, and that will allow me to change my rotation, but yet still inherit the rest of the properties. There's also a light component. Light in the scene contains a light component, and this contains things such as the color of the light, the attenuation parameters, and the dimmer switch, how bright the light is. You can also change the type of light. So if you see the light back there is a point light, we can change that to be a directional light, or an ambient light, or a spotlight. We're going to put it back as a point light, so we get all the shadows the way we want. Next is the scene graph component, and really all this is a NIF file path property that points to a particular NIF file. So if we select pretty much any object, any entity in the scene, it has a scene graph property that has a particular NIF file specified. This was a component that is in this scene but was actually created, and you'll notice down here you'll have the add, edit, delete on this property, so we can, or this component, so we can bring this up and edit this particular property. We can add properties to this component. So it's not a standard component that ships with Gamebryo, but this particular component contains properties that are used by the SceneApp tool for previewing purposes. The shadow generator component contains lots of parameters about generating shadows with the Gamebryo shadowing system. So if we switch to a light, one of the lights in the scene here, it's actually the directional light that I want, and let's switch to a different camera here. So notice we've selected this directional light, which as we rotate around you'll see has shadows. I think we're getting a little bit of gimbal lock here. There we go. And we can change with the shadow component, shadow generator component, we can go in here and change the shadow technique that's being used. Switch this to standard. Notice it gets all very blocky down here. For PCF, it's a little bit more smooth, as well as the size of the shadow maps. Get much lower resolution shadow maps, and the unaffected casters and other properties. The terrain component is used when placing terrain in the scene, and has a number of properties that are set directly and can be set via the terrain panel. The terrain sector component is another component that is used for placing terrain. The transformation component is a very basic component, just contains rotation, translation, and scale properties. This is used on pretty much every entity in the scene, and those properties are edited by the translation interaction modes. And there's a water component. This component is also used when placing terrain and contains many of the properties that are used to define what the water will look like. That's an overview of the components in SceneDesigner.